I was born into a world where nothing came easy, not even the air you breathed. My family lived on the edge of town, in a dilapidated house that sagged under the weight of time. My parents worked hard, but there was never quite enough. The kind of place where people dream of escaping, but rarely get the chance. I don't remember a time when I didn't want more than the cramped kitchen where my mother slaved over a hot stove, more than the cold, damp attic I shared with my younger brother. But dreaming was all we had. I was 16 the day I realized I would have to leave. My father's back was bad, his hands shaking with arthritis, and my mother's eyes were always tired, burdened by the weight of the years. I had no illusions about my future if I stayed in that house. College wasn't an option for me, not unless I figured out how to make something out of nothing. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late in the spring, when the first real glimpse of what my life would become hit me. I was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in front of me, when my mother, Margaret, came in from the porch, her face lined with worry. "James," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking, maybe you should stop with all this school nonsense. You know we can't afford it. You're better off learning a trade, working with your hands." I glanced up from my notebook, trying to mask the sting of her words. I wasn't some mechanic or carpenter. I wasn't going to spend my life fixing things for other people. I had bigger dreams. Dreams too big for this small house, too big for the life they wanted for me. "I'm not gonna end up like you," I said, the words harsh even to my own ears. "I'm not gonna get stuck in this place. Mom, I'm gonna make something of myself." Her face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. She knew better than anyone the weight of this world. The world that tells you no matter how hard you work, how much you give, you'll always be the same. But I wasn't going to be the same. "Just don't forget where you come from, James," she said quietly. And for a moment, I could hear the worry in her voice. "You've got the whole world ahead of you, but don't lose your roots." I didn't reply. What could I say? She couldn't understand. I was already on the path. I wasn't going to let anything or anyone keep me from that. The day I left for the city, it was my father who came out to the car. He stood there in his faded work boots, his hair graying, his shoulders stooped. I remember how quiet it was that morning, the air thick with unspoken words. "Make something of yourself, kid," he said. His voice cracked with age and regret. "I will, Dad. I promise." The words felt like a vow, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking into the unknown with something to prove. I started my real estate career not by choice, but by necessity. I needed money, and quickly. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something I could build, something that could get me out of the poverty trap. I started small, selling low-end homes in a market that didn't care about ambition, but about the bottom line. The first few months were tough. I spent most of my time in dusty offices and empty houses, struggling to make a sale. But I kept pushing, kept hustling. There were nights I stayed up until 2 a.m., cold coffee beside me, calling every lead I could find. Every rejection felt like a personal affront, but I learned to shrug them off. This was my life now. This was how I was going to make it. And then, finally, I sold a house. A small, run-down 2-bedroom on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I remember the feeling of that first paycheck in my hand, like holding a ticket to freedom. I called my mother, hoping she could hear the pride in my voice. "Mom, I did it," I said, the words rushing out in a breathless burst. "I sold a house." She was quiet for a moment, and I felt a pang of doubt. Had I disappointed her? Had she been right all along? But then she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always had it in you, James. I knew you would. You've got that fire." It was the first time in my life I felt like I'd done something worthy in her eyes. As the years passed, I built my real estate business from the ground up. But it wasn't just about houses and deals. It was about making something real, something that would endure. I wanted to be someone who mattered, someone who could change the course of her life and her daughter's future. Emma deserved more than I ever had. It was funny, really. The more I climbed, the more I felt the distance between myself and my roots. I was always reaching for something higher, but I couldn't shake the fear that I was leaving parts of myself behind. The girl who had dreamed of escape was now a woman who had everything, except for the one thing that mattered most. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Emma's voice broke through my thoughts, dragging me back to the present. She was sitting at the kitchen table, picking at her cereal, her expression unreadable. At 16, she was already worlds apart from the little girl I'd raised. "I'm fine," I said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "You know how it is, just another day at the office." She rolled her eyes, the kind of gesture that said everything without needing words. "You work too much, Mom. You know that, right?" "I'm doing this for you," I said, my tone sharp, maybe too sharp. "You want to go to college, travel, have the kind of life I never could. That's why I'm doing it." She sighed, her gaze distant. "I know, Mom, but sometimes it feels like you don't trust me to make my own choices, like you're always planning my life for me." I froze. Her words stung, more than I cared to admit. Was that how she saw me? A mother trying to control her every move. Was I really pushing her away, even though I was only trying to give her the world? "I'm not trying to control you, Emma," I said quietly. I just want you to have everything. More than I ever did." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between us felt like an unspoken agreement, a recognition that no matter how much I tried to give her, she was slipping further from me. I sat back in my chair, a heavy weight settling in my chest. I wasn't sure how we had gotten here. This place of silence, of unmet expectations. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to give up. Not on Emma, not on myself. I would keep building, keep pushing, because that's what I had always done. And I wouldn't stop now. For all the walls I'd built around myself, around my heart, my mind, my ambitions, there was one thing I couldn't protect: the deep, aching desire for connection. The years had been long and demanding. My focus trained solely on building a future for Emma and me, but somewhere along the way, I'd lost touch with the part of me that longed for more than just survival. I had buried it under endless work, under the weight of my own expectations. But when Michael Jones came into my life, that long-suppressed part of me stirred awake. It started innocently enough. I met him at an open house. He was a potential buyer, or so he said. He was polite, interested in the property, though his eyes seemed more focused on me than on the house. At 13 years younger than me, I wasn't sure what to make of him at first. I had always steered clear of younger men. But there was something in the way he spoke, his enthusiasm, his quick wit, that drew me in. He was charming in that way that could disarm anyone. His smile was warm, his words smooth. I had heard it all before. The rehearsed lines, the practiced flirtations, but with Michael, it felt different. It felt easy, natural. He wasn't like the men I'd met in the business world, all rigid handshakes and calculated smiles. There was an authenticity in him, or at least, that's what I told myself. "I'm glad you decided to come by," I said, walking him out of the property after the showing. "Not many people are brave enough to look at a place like this." Michael chuckled, a sound that made the whole world feel lighter. "Brave? I wouldn't call it that. It's a great property, though. Good location, potential. You've got a good eye, James." I smiled at the compliment, but there was something about the way he said my name that caught my attention. It wasn't just a professional formality. There was a warmth in his voice, a personal touch that sent a small, almost imperceptible shiver down my spine. "Well, it's my job to have a good eye," I replied, trying to keep things light. "But thank you. If you're interested in putting in an offer, I'd be happy to walk you through the paperwork." "Actually," he said, taking a step closer, "I was thinking, maybe we could grab coffee sometime. Talk about the house, or just talk." I don't know anyone in town, and you seem like someone who could point me in the right direction. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should entertain the idea. I was here to work, not to start something with a client. But there was something about his presence, his earnestness, that made the thought of saying no feel like a missed opportunity. Maybe it was the years of isolation, the countless nights spent alone after Emma had grown more independent. Maybe I was just tired of being alone. I'm not really sure that's a good idea, Michael, I said cautiously. I'm your realtor. It might complicate things. He smiled that smile, the one that could convince anyone to reconsider. And for a brief second, I felt my resolve waver. I promise, no strings attached. He said gently, just a coffee. You've been so kind to help me with the property. It'd be nice to get to know you outside of the business side of things. That was the moment. The moment when the walls I'd so carefully built for years started to crack. I didn't know it then, but that coffee would be the first step into something I wasn't ready for. Our first coffee turned into another, and then another. It wasn't long before I found myself looking forward to our conversations. Michael had an easy way about him, a casual confidence that didn't demand attention, but earned it nonetheless. He'd tell me stories of his life, growing up in a small town, trying to make his mark in a world that seemed to overlook him. His words were always filled with energy, with a kind of youthful optimism that made me feel young again. And yet there was depth in him too. Moments when his eyes would cloud over, when he would say something with a weight that suggested there was more to him than the easygoing exterior. I found myself listening to him with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. I was starved for connection, for someone who wasn't just a client or an obligation, and Michael, with his charm and warmth, gave me that. You know, I never really expected this, I said one evening, after we'd been out for dinner at a small Italian restaurant. We had been talking about everything and nothing, the politics of the town, our favorite books, the best places to grab a drink. It felt comfortable. Expected what? Michael asked, leaning forward, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. Us. This, I said, motioning between us. I didn't think I'd find someone like you, at this stage of my life. I've been too focused on work, on keeping things together for Emma. I haven't had time to think about, well, this. He smiled, his eyes softening. I get it. Life gets busy, especially when you're taking care of someone else. But you deserve to have a little joy too, James. You deserve more than just the hustle. I felt a flicker of something warm and electric, ripple through me. The last time I'd felt this way, I was a young woman, excited about the possibilities of life. Back then, the future had seemed like an endless stream of possibilities. But now, as I approached my late 40s, I couldn't remember the last time I'd really wanted anything for myself. But there was a shadow in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite shake. Michael's charm was undeniable, but it was too polished, too rehearsed. Sometimes I'd catch him in moments of hesitation, his smile faltering for just a second, or his eyes darting away when the conversation went too deep. I didn't let it bother me. It was probably just my insecurity talking. I had been burned before, after all. I had lost my first husband, Thomas, to a tragic accident. Since then, I had put my trust in very few people. But Michael was different, or so I convinced myself. But the little doubts lingered, just below the surface. I remember one night, after one of our dinners, Michael drove me home. As we pulled up to my house, I found myself hesitating. The door of my car was still half open, but I hadn't moved to get out. I could hear the faint hum of the engine, the quiet rhythm of our breaths. "You're quiet tonight," Michael said, his voice soft, as though he sensed the shift in the air. "Is everything okay?" I looked over at him, taking in the warmth of his gaze, the way his lips curved slightly upward. There was something in me that wanted to tell him everything. The doubts, the fears, the walls I'd been trying to hold up. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, trying to keep things light. I'm fine. Just thinking. You don't have to think alone, he said, his voice low, almost intimate. I'm here. And in that moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let go of the doubts, the fears, the years of walls I'd constructed around my heart. I wanted to feel something other than the weight of responsibility, to feel what it was like to be cared for. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. Chapter 3. The ties that bind. The deeper I got into my relationship with Michael, the more I realized just how much I was willing to risk. I'd spent years focusing on Emma, on my business, on the intricate maze of responsibilities I built around myself. But with Michael, it felt like I was stepping into a new world, one that was full of possibility, but also uncertainty. The ties that bound me to my old life, to my identity as a mother and a businesswoman, began to feel tighter, more suffocating. But there was something about Michael that made me question whether I had to stay bound forever. Was it possible to be more than just the person I had been, without losing everything I had built? It had been a few months since Michael and I first started seeing each other, and by now I knew I was falling for him. It wasn't love. At least, not yet. But it was something close, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. There were moments when the world outside our relationship disappeared, when it was just us, laughing over dinner, or walking through the park on quiet Sunday mornings, as if we had all the time in the world. But as much as I tried to ignore it, the complexity of my life kept intruding. There was Emma, always on the edge of my thoughts, even as she grew more distant with each passing day. And then there was Michael, whose charm was undeniable, but whose occasional, almost imperceptible evasions had started to raise small red flags in my mind. It was nothing concrete, just fleeting moments of doubt that I couldn't quite shake. Do you ever think about the future? I asked one evening as we sat on the back porch of my house, the soft hum of cicadas filling the silence between us. I had invited Michael over for dinner, and we were relaxing with glasses of wine, enjoying the last few moments of daylight. Michael looked at me, his expression unreadable. He was a man who knew how to keep his thoughts behind a mask, but there was something in his eyes, something that seemed to flicker, almost imperceptibly. "Of course I think about the future," he said after a pause, his voice casual but distant. "Who doesn't? But right now, I'm more interested in the present, in us. We can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow." I studied him for a moment, watching the way he played with the edge of his wine glass, the way his jaw tightened slightly. There was something guarded about his response, and despite myself, I felt a stir of unease. It wasn't the first time I'd sensed a gap between what he said and what he really meant. "You know what I mean," I pressed gently, setting my glass down on the table between us. "I mean, we're not getting any younger. Don't you think it's time to start thinking about the long term?" Michael chuckled lightly, as though the question amused him, but there was an edge to his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe, but I'm happy right where I am. Why rush things?" The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I hadn't asked him for marriage, for anything formal. But I had hoped for something more. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I didn't mean to pressure you. I guess I'm thinking about what comes next for me. And I thought you'd be a part of it." For a moment, the air between us felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Then Michael reached across the table and placed his hand on mine, his touch warm, reassuring. "James," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But we're on our own path, okay? Let's take it one step at a time. No need to rush." His words soothed something deep within me, and for a while, I allowed myself to believe him. Maybe I was rushing things. Maybe my fears were my own, not his. I needed to trust him, to let go of the insecurities that had been building up ever since I lost Thomas. But even as I reassured myself, a small voice at the back of my mind whispered, "Are you really trusting him, or just letting yourself be deceived?" As the weeks passed, I tried to quiet those doubts. But Emma's increasing distance was harder to ignore. The last time we had a real conversation felt like it had happened in another lifetime. She was 22 now, living in the city, working part-time in a cafe, while she figured out what she wanted from life. I had hoped that by now, she would have found her path. But the truth was, we couldn't seem to connect anymore. One Sunday, I invited her to brunch, desperate for some semblance of closeness. She arrived late, as usual, with a distant expression, as though I were a stranger rather than her mother. We exchanged pleasantries at first, but I could sense the underlying tension between us. "Emma," I began, pushing my eggs around on my plate. "I've been thinking. You and we need to talk." She paused mid-bite, her eyes flicking up to meet mine with an unreadable expression. "About what?" she asked, her voice casual, too casual. "About everything," I said, my frustration creeping into my tone. "You've been pulling away from me, and I don't know why. What's going on? We're family, Emma. Don't you think we owe it to each other to be honest?" She exhaled slowly, as though considering whether to engage at all. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just figuring things out." "You're figuring things out by avoiding me," I said, my voice rising a little. "I'm here for you, Emma. You don't have to go through everything alone. I just want to understand. I don't want to lose you." Her eyes hardened, and for a brief moment, I saw the same defiance that had started to grow in her ever since she'd reached adulthood. "You can't control me, Mom," she said, the words sharp. "I don't need your approval for everything I do. And I definitely don't need you making decisions for me. You've done that my whole life." I blinked, the sting of her words like a slap across my face. But before I could respond, she pushed her chair back from the table, her face set in a way that told me this conversation was over. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this right now," she said, standing up and leaving the cafe without another word. I sat there, stunned, my heart heavy with the weight of her words. I wasn't sure when our relationship had become so fractured, when the ties that bound us had grown so thin. All I knew was that I didn't know how to fix it. That evening, Michael called, his voice cheerful, as if nothing had happened. I wasn't sure I was in the mood for his upbeat tone, but I answered anyway. "How was your day?" he asked, a lightness in his voice that seemed out of place given the turmoil in my own heart. "It was difficult," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. "Emma and I had a fight." There was a pause on the other end. Then Michael's voice softened. "What about?" "She's pulling away from me, Michael. I don't know what to do anymore." "Family's hard," he said, his words carefully chosen. "But I'm sure you'll work it out. You're strong, James. You've always been strong." I appreciated his words, but something about his tone, something about his detached, almost rehearsed sympathy, made me feel even more alone. Was he really listening to me? Or was he just trying to smooth things over so I wouldn't ask any more questions? I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. What is happening to me? As much as I wanted to believe that Michael and I had a future, something deep within me whispered that I was holding on to him for the wrong reasons. I wanted the connection, the love, the warmth, but in doing so, I had overlooked the things that mattered most. The ties that bound me to Emma, to the woman I used to be, were fraying fast, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on to Michael, I knew in my heart that the future was never as simple as I had imagined. There are moments in life when the truth feels so heavy that it crushes you before you even fully recognize it. And then there are moments when the truth unfolds gradually, its weight sneaking up on you, just like the slow, quiet breaking of a dam. I would like to say that I was blindsided by what happened next, but deep down I knew, somewhere inside of me, I had always known something wasn't right. The warning signs had been there, so faint that I almost convinced myself they were nothing more than the figments of an anxious mind. But when the truth finally came to light, I realized I had been blind only because I didn't want to see. It started innocently enough. Just the small, fleeting moments of tension I had sensed between Michael and Emma. The way they avoided eye contact when I was around. the subtle shifts in the way they spoke to each other. Emma would come home late at night, and Michael would always offer a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a look that felt like a secret between them. At first, I chalked it up to my insecurities. After all, I had always been a mother who hovered too much, a woman who gave too much, and perhaps that was why Emma had started to pull away. But over time, the cracks began to widen, and my suspicion grew into a gnawing certainty. One evening, the truth hit me with a force I couldn't have predicted. I was returning from a meeting late at night, too tired to notice much of anything. The house was quiet, except for the soft murmur of voices coming from the living room. My first instinct was to ignore it, to go upstairs and fall into bed, but something pulled me toward the room. Something that told me I had to face it. I was already standing at the door before I realized I had moved. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The voices, soft, too intimate, cut through the silence. Michael was speaking, and there was something in his tone that was different from the usual light-hearted charm. It was hushed, tender in a way that made my skin crawl. "You always know how to make me feel better," Michael said, his voice low. Emma's response was even softer, too soft for me to catch at first. But when I heard it, when I heard the way she said his name, everything inside of me stilled. "I just want to make things right between us," Emma whispered. I leaned in closer, as if the act of listening could somehow shield me from what I was about to hear. I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't stop myself. The next words were a sharp, jagged truth that cut through the thin veil of my denial. "Then stop holding back," Michael said, his voice unmistakably intimate now. "I've waited long enough." A quiet gasp left Emma, and then there was the sound of her breath catching, followed by the silence of a kiss between my daughter and the man I loved. I didn't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to freeze. The room around me blurred, the voices in my head growing louder. How could I not have seen it? How could I have been so blind? I stumbled back, retreating down the hallway with a shock that rendered me numb. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as though the weight of everything I had tried to build, my family, my life, had come crashing down all at once. I didn't want to believe what I had just heard, but I knew, deep down, that it was true. The next few days were a blur, the kind of blur that happens when you are moving through the motions of life, but your mind is somewhere else, in pieces. I avoided them both, Michael and Emma, like the plague. The house, once a place of solace, had become a battlefield, and I was no longer sure where I stood. Michael would send me texts, apologizing for being distant, for not answering calls, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Emma, ever the distant one, pretended as if nothing had changed, though I could see the guilt eating at her from the inside out. She knew I knew, and I could see the quiet fear in her eyes whenever our gazes met. I had always prided myself on being strong, on being the rock in this family. But now, the very foundation of my strength was shaking, and I didn't know how to stop it. One afternoon, as the silence between us reached its breaking point, Emma cornered me in the kitchen. She had been unusually quiet all week, but now she was standing there, her hands twisted in front of her like she had something to confess. I didn't need to ask. I knew. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look at her. My back was turned as I stirred the soup on the stove, trying to keep my hands busy, trying to stave off the rising nausea in my stomach. "About what?" I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the pain that had been roiling inside me. Emma stepped forward, and I could hear her nervous breath behind me. "I know what you think," she said. "I know what you heard, and I'm sorry." I closed my eyes for a brief second, fighting back the sting of tears. Sorry. That's all she had to offer. After everything. "Sorry," I repeated, my voice thick with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Sorry for betraying me. For betraying us. Is that all you have to say?" Her silence spoke volumes. I could hear the tremble in her voice as she responded. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mom. I don't know what to say. Michael and we've been seeing each other for a while now. But I didn't think it would hurt you. You didn't think. I spun around, my face flushed with emotion, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. You didn't think about anyone but yourself. You, both of you, betrayed me. And you didn't think that would hurt. Please, she begged, her voice breaking now. I never wanted to hurt you. But you've always been so distant, so focused on everything else. And Michael, he made me feel seen. He made me feel important. I felt a surge of something raw and aching. Important. Emma, I gave you everything. Everything I had. And this is how you repay me. I shook my head in disbelief. I spent years putting my life on hold for you. And you, this is how you repay me. Mom, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible now, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. The apology hung in the air, too late to undo the damage. Too late to take back the betrayal, the silence, the shattered trust. And though I could hear her regret, I couldn't feel it. All I felt was a deep, hollow emptiness. Later that evening, Michael showed up at my door. He stood there, his face serious, almost too serious, as though he had prepared himself for this confrontation. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers. But instead, I just stood there, cold and silent. James, we need to talk, he said softly, his voice lacking its usual warmth. It was a tone I had never heard before, one that seemed to speak of something darker, more calculating. I took a deep breath and crossed my arms, staring at him coldly. Talk. After what you did. What both of you did. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away for just a moment before he returned his gaze to mine. I never meant for things to go this far, but you were always so busy, so focused on your work. I thought you wouldn't mind. I felt my chest tighten, the heat of betrayal rising to my face. You thought I wouldn't mind. You've been seeing my daughter behind my back, Michael, and you thought I wouldn't mind. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. I never wanted to hurt you, James, but it happened. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Sorry. The word again. It felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to cover up the deep, irreparable damage. I trusted you, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I trusted both of you. That night, after Michael left and Emma had retreated to her room, I sat alone in the quiet house. The walls that had once felt safe now seemed to close in on me, pressing in from every side. I was no longer sure who I was, who we were. The ties that had once bound us together, family, love, loyalty, had frayed beyond repair. And in their place was a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The hardest part of betrayal isn't the discovery itself, it's the aftermath. It's the sharp, lingering feeling that something inside you has been irrevocably shattered. You can't simply put the pieces back together, no matter how hard you try. And you can't pretend that everything is fine. The fracture in the relationship is there, right under the surface, and no matter how much time passes, it can never fully heal. It took me weeks to decide what to do about Michael and Emma. The two people I trusted most had betrayed me in the most intimate way, and every attempt at rebuilding any semblance of trust felt like an exercise in futility. The damage was done, and the scars were permanent. But as I sat in my office late one evening, after another round of sleepless nights, I realized that there was one thing I could control: the final chapters of my story, my legacy. And I wasn't about to let Michael or Emma have any part in it. The decision to revise my will had not come lightly. I'd spent years planning my estate, arranging my finances so that Emma would be taken care of long after I was gone. I had always assumed that she would inherit everything: the business, the house, the security. But now, everything felt different. Trust had been broken in the deepest way, and I couldn't bring myself to leave her a penny, Not when she had so casually destroyed the trust we had built. In the quiet, dimly lit office, I looked over the documents, my hand hovering over the pen. For the first time in my life, I wasn't making this decision out of guilt or love or obligation. I was making it out of sheer necessity. I will protect my legacy, and I will make sure they never benefit from what they've done to me. I added the necessary changes, revising the beneficiary clauses of my life insurance policy, naming Victoria Carter, my loyal maid, confidant, and friend of over 30 years, as the sole beneficiary. Victoria had been with me through everything, through the ups and downs, through the moments of joy and pain. She was the only one I could trust, the only one who had never let me down. Victoria came into my life when I had first built my real estate empire. A young woman with a quiet dignity who had been working as a maid for a wealthy family down the street. I knew from the first moment we spoke that she was different. She had a kind of calm strength about her, a steadfast loyalty that I had not known I needed until I found it in her. Over the years, our relationship had evolved beyond employer and servant. She had become family to me. Victoria. I called out one morning as I sat at my desk, signing the last of the papers. She entered the room, a soft knock at the door preceding her presence. "Yes, Miss Monroe," she asked, her eyes warm but curious, as always. "I need to ask you a favor," I said, looking up from the papers. "It's a difficult favor, but it's the only one I can trust you to keep." She came closer, her expression never wavering. "Of course, Ms. Monroe, you know I'll do anything for you." I hesitated for just a moment. "I'm making some changes to my will, and I need you to be the beneficiary. I trust you more than anyone else in my life." Her face softened in surprise, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I don't know what to say. I'm honored, Ms. Monroe. But are you sure? I mean, with your daughter." I looked her in the eye. "I'm sure. You're the only one who's been there for me, Victoria. You've seen me at my worst and never faltered. I owe you more than I can ever repay, and this is the only way I can make sure my wishes are honored." There was a brief moment of silence before she nodded, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I'll honor your wishes, Ms. Monroe. You can count on me." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders in that moment. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about securing a part of myself. Someone would carry my legacy forward. Someone who understood what I had built and who would protect it from those who had betrayed me. The days that followed were a haze of silent moments. Emma continued to act as if nothing had changed. Michael, too, tried his usual charm, but I could see through the facade. The tension in the house was unbearable, and the silence between us was more deafening than any words. There were no more family dinners, no more outings together. I avoided them both as much as possible, leaving them to their own devices. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had done. My decision to exclude Emma from my will felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, but it was a necessary weight. I loved my daughter, despite everything, but love could no longer justify trust. Trust had to be earned, and Emma had squandered it. Michael had too. The morning I received the call from the lawyer was one I had been anticipating for days. The finalization of the changes to my life insurance policy, the revisions to my will. It was all in motion now. As I sat in my living room, sipping coffee, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality settle over me. The lawyer's voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "Ms. Monroe, I just wanted to confirm that the revisions to your will and the beneficiary changes have been completed. Victoria Carter is now the sole beneficiary of both your estate and your life insurance policy." I nodded, though no one could see me. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, though I felt the weight of the moment. This was it. The final act had been set in motion. My legacy was no longer bound to the daughter I had once trusted, but to the woman who had been loyal to me when no one else had. Later that day, I found myself sitting on the porch, looking out at the sprawling garden. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was peaceful, almost therapeutic. But inside, I was anything but calm. The betrayal still stung, still left an ache in my chest. I thought of Emma, of the daughter I had raised with such care, who had turned her back on me in the most painful way. And I thought of Michael, the man I had let into my life, who had taken everything I offered and shattered it with his lies. But then my thoughts turned to Victoria, always steady, always there. She had been my true companion, my true friend. She had been the one to keep me grounded when everything else seemed to be falling apart. And I knew, in that moment, that my decision was the right one. Emma had made her choices, Michael had made his, but I could still choose too. That evening, Michael confronted me. His presence in the doorway felt like an intrusion, a reminder of everything I had lost. He stood there, his usual confident posture now tinged with uncertainty. "James," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I need to talk to you." I didn't look up. "About what?" He stepped closer, and for a moment, I almost believed he was going to apologize. But the words never came. Instead, he said, "I've seen the changes you made to your will. You really are leaving everything to her, aren't you?" I finally met his gaze. "I am. Victoria is the one person who has never betrayed me." He flinched, though he quickly masked it with a smile. "You really think she can handle it all? That she'll take care of everything like you did?" "I trust her," I said, my voice unwavering. "She's the only one I can trust anymore." There was a long, heavy pause. Then Michael let out a short, dry laugh. "I never thought you'd be this cold, James. This calculating." I stood up, meeting his eyes with a calmness that surprised even me. "You don't know what cold is, Michael. You crossed a line, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." He stared at me for a long moment, as though trying to gauge whether I was bluffing. But then, finally, he turned and walked away, leaving me with my thoughts, and the peace that came with knowing I had done what was necessary. In the days that followed, Michael and Emma kept their distance. They never confronted me again, and I had no intention of confronting them. What was there left to say? The silence between us was enough. I knew that the choices I had made would haunt them in the years to come, perhaps not immediately, but in time. And as for me, I could finally breathe. The final act had been completed, and with it, I had taken back control of my own narrative. I had chosen resilience, and in that, I found my peace. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is nothing at all. The world outside my window seemed to carry on, as if it didn't know or care about the storm raging in my heart. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Everything was as it had always been, quiet, serene, unchanging. But I knew better. I could feel the shift in the air, the fracture in the very fabric of the life I had worked so hard to build. Yet, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like fighting it. Maybe it was the culmination of everything. The weight of betrayal, the strain of loneliness, the slow decline of my health that had started to seep into my bones with an inevitability that felt as crushing as the silence between us. Maybe it was the realization that I was beyond repair, beyond saving. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying it all alone. Whatever it was, I had come to a quiet surrender. The days after the decision were marked by an eerie stillness in the house. Emma had started to distance herself further, though she no longer had the nerve to confront me, nor did I have the heart to face her. Her absence was deafening, as though her silence spoke louder than any words could. She had not yet come to terms with the changes I had made to my will, and though I knew she would eventually find out, I couldn't bring myself to care. As for Michael, he too had withdrawn, though his distance was more noticeable. I imagined he thought he could win me back by laying low, but I wasn't the same woman who had welcomed him into my life with open arms. I had learned too much, seen too much. There was no going back. But it wasn't just the emotional distance that gnawed at me. It was my body, too. Something was wrong. I had tried to ignore the creeping fatigue, the nausea, the headaches that had started a few months ago. I had brushed it off as stress or the consequences of years of sleepless nights, but now it had become impossible to deny. My strength was slowly draining, like water leaking from a broken dam. Victoria had noticed, of course. She always noticed. One morning, after a particularly long night of tossing and turning, I woke up to find her sitting beside my bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she had been waiting for me to wake up. Her presence was a comfort, and yet I felt a pang of guilt. I had never wanted to burden her with my struggles, not when she had already given me so much. "Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice soft but insistent, "you need to rest. You've been pushing yourself too hard." I sat up slowly, the movement sending a wave of dizziness over me. I gripped the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself. "I'm fine," I murmured, though I knew it was a lie. Victoria didn't say anything at first. She simply reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and handed it to me. Her eyes, though kind, held an unspoken concern. It was the kind of concern I had seen countless times in her, always for me, never for herself. "You're not fine," she said quietly, her voice full of understanding. "And it's okay to admit it. You don't have to carry it all alone." I looked up at her, my chest tightening with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: vulnerability. I had always been the one who fixed things, who kept it all together. But now I was losing my grip on everything, and I couldn't even pretend I wasn't afraid. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," I confessed, the words coming out in a whisper. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going like this." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gently placed her hand over mine, the warmth of her touch grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. "You don't have to pretend for me, Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice a quiet balm against my frayed nerves. "You've done more than enough. You've built a life, a legacy, and you've given everything to your daughter. You don't owe anyone anything else." Her words settled in the space between us, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to close my eyes and simply feel. I had spent so much of my life chasing after something: success, love, approval. And now, I realized that I had overlooked something far more important: peace. The following weeks passed in a blur. I stopped fighting the ache in my body, the deep exhaustion that permeated every waking moment. There were days when I barely had the energy to get out of bed. Days when even the simple act of sitting up felt like too much. I saw doctors, specialists, all of them offering theories but no answers. The pain in my body was a mystery, and I had grown tired of searching for an explanation. I had lived my life with such purpose, such determination to succeed, to protect, to provide, but now all of that seemed so distant. Victoria continued to care for me, her presence unwavering. She handled the business calls, kept the house running, and did everything she could to make my life easier. But I saw the toll it took on her too. She wasn't getting any younger, and I had begun to worry about how long she could keep up with everything. One evening, as I sat in the living room staring out at the garden, I could hear her in the kitchen humming a quiet tune. The sound of her voice, soft and sweet, felt like the last anchor I had in the world. I glanced up when she entered the room, holding a tray with a cup of tea. She placed it on the table in front of me, her fingers brushing mine as she did so. There was a gentleness in her touch, as though she understood exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know myself. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, her eyes soft with concern. I exhaled slowly, the weight of her question pressing on me. I didn't want to lie to her anymore. I didn't want to pretend that I was okay. "Not great," I said simply, my voice raspy with exhaustion. "I feel like I'm fading, Victoria. Like I'm slipping through my own fingers." She sat down beside me, her presence comforting, grounding. "You're not fading, Ms. Monroe. You're just resting, letting go, and that's okay." I met her gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to lean into the truth of her words. It was okay to let go. It was okay to surrender. I don't know what comes next, I said, my voice trembling with the vulnerability I had hidden for so long. But I trust you, Victoria. I trust you more than anyone else. Her hand found mine again, holding it tightly. Whatever comes next, I'll be here. I'll always be here. And in that moment, I knew that I didn't need anything more. I had found the peace I had been seeking, not in the world outside or in my accomplishments, but in the quiet, unspoken bond between us. In the weeks that followed, I continued to fade. My body, once strong and vibrant, began to wither as my health deteriorated. But my mind was at ease. I was no longer chasing anything. I had let go of the weight that had held me captive for so long. Emma and Michael stayed away. Their guilt, their shame, had become too much to bear. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't care to. My legacy, the one I had fought so hard to build, would be passed on in the only way I could control it now, through the quiet hands of Victoria, the woman who had never asked for anything but had given me everything. And so, as the days passed, I surrendered not just to my body's decline, but to the knowledge that I had lived my life fully, that I had loved, and I had fought, and I had endured. I had given everything I could. Now, it was time to rest. The end had come. It arrived like a quiet tide, creeping in slowly but steadily, until it was undeniable. James Monroe, the woman who had built an empire, the woman who had weathered betrayals, heartache, and the relentless tide of time, was slipping away. She had surrendered her body to the inevitable, but her mind, her legacy, remained sharp. She had outlived the world she had once shaped, and now, in the final hours of her life, the consequences of everything she had built and broken would come rushing to the surface. The reckoning wasn't just about death. It wasn't simply about the slow surrender of life, as painful as that was. It was about the truth, about how lives, once intertwined in love and trust, could unravel so completely, about the price of betrayal. And now, it was time for everyone else to face that price. The house was eerily quiet. The once vibrant hum of daily life had slowed to a muffled stillness. I sat by the window, gazing out at the garden that had once been a symbol of all the growth I had fought for. The flowers were blooming, as always, but the beauty of them seemed far away now. My body was fragile, my breathing shallow, but my mind was clear. Victoria had been by my side for weeks, her quiet presence a balm for my soul. But she had become more than just my caretaker. She had become the keeper of my story, my legacy, the only person who could understand what all of this meant. I didn't have much time left. Emma had not visited. I wasn't surprised. We both knew that the gulf between us was unbridgeable now. Even after everything had happened, after the betrayal with Michael, I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that there might be a reconciliation. But Emma, as always, had chosen silence. She had not responded to my messages. She had not made an effort to visit. The shame, the guilt, or perhaps the bitterness was too much for her to overcome. But Michael, he had come. It was late one evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps outside my door. I looked up to see him standing there, hesitating, his hand gripping the doorframe. Michael, the man who had once promised me the world, the man who had slipped into my life so smoothly, like a charm that had turned into poison. "You wanted to see me." His voice was low, guarded. He looked different, older, perhaps, or maybe just more disheveled. The confident swagger he used to have was gone. Now he was just a man facing the consequences of his own actions. "I'm surprised you came." My voice was weak but steady. I didn't know what I expected from him at this point, but I certainly wasn't expecting an apology, not from Michael. He stepped into the room, standing by my bedside, though he didn't come closer. He looked at me with a mix of regret and something I couldn't quite place. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. I didn't know how to. He faltered. "I didn't know how to face you." I didn't speak immediately. I had no desire to make him feel better about the choices he had made. There was nothing he could say now that would change the past. So I let the silence hang between us for a while. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," I finally said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a sharp blade. "You think a few words will undo everything. The lies, the betrayal." He flinched but didn't back away. "James, I don't." My hand lifted weakly from the blanket, as though trying to ward him off. "You don't get to explain yourself anymore. I know what you did, and it cost me more than I'll ever be able to express." He opened his mouth to speak again, but I stopped him. "I'm not here to hear your excuses. I'm here to tell you something." My breath hitched, and I coughed lightly, the weight of my words pressing heavily against my chest. "What is it?" he asked, unsure, his eyes flickering with something that looked like hope. "I've made my decisions," I said, looking straight at him. "I revised my will. I changed everything. You and Emma, you're both out. There's nothing for either of you in there." Michael's face went pale. He stepped back a step, his expression a mixture of confusion and panic. "What? What do you mean?" His voice cracked slightly, as though he was struggling to maintain control. "I mean you'll get nothing," I replied coldly. "Not a penny, not a thing. It all goes to Victoria. She's the only one who's been loyal to me. She's the one who deserves it." His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Then, slowly, his shock turned to something darker. "You're doing this now. At the end, you think this is going to make me feel guilty. You think I care about money." I could feel my strength waning, but I held his gaze, unwavering. "You took what was mine, Michael, and now you'll never touch it again." He took a deep breath and exhaled, his frustration mounting. This isn't how I thought it would end, James." There was a brief moment of hesitation. "But I guess you were always about the money, weren't you? The empire, all that stuff you built. None of it mattered. Not to you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Is that what you think?" My voice broke. "You really think I built everything for money? For power? No, I built it for the people I loved. I built it for you, for Emma." I paused, forcing back the rush of emotion. "But I'll be damned if I let you destroy it all with your greed and lies." Michael stood in silence for a long time. Finally, he turned, his back to me, his shoulders hunched as though he was trying to make sense of everything I had said. "I don't know what to say, James. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am." I didn't reply. His words, though perhaps genuine, didn't carry the weight I needed them to. They were too little, too late. The damage had been done. Later that evening, as Michael left, Victoria entered the room, her expression neutral but concerned. She had heard the conversation, no doubt, and I could feel her presence before I saw her. "He's gone," she asked softly, as she settled into the chair next to my bed. I nodded. "He's gone. And I told him everything. I told him he wouldn't get a dime." Victoria's eyes softened. "You did what you had to do, Ms. Monroe." I sighed, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. "I did what I thought was right. But the truth is, I don't feel better. I don't feel anything." She reached for my hand, her fingers warm, her grip steady. "You will. In time. You've let go of the things that hurt you most. That takes strength." I closed my eyes, allowing her words to sink in. The reckoning had come, and though it had been painful, it had brought clarity. There were no more illusions, no more pretending, only the truth, and the cost of that truth. The following days passed in a haze. Emma never came to visit. I didn't expect her to. She was lost to me now, as lost as Michael had become. But Victoria remained, steady and sure, the one constant in a world that had unraveled. As I lay in the quiet of my room, I knew this was the end. My life was slipping away. But my legacy, my true legacy, would live on in the hands of someone who understood its worth. The reckoning had come for Michael, for Emma, and for me. The choices we made, the lives we lived, the betrayals and the love. They had all led us here. And now, all that was left was the quiet surrender to the inevitable. Time moves on, as it always does, but in the stillness of the world, some things refuse to fade. Some legacies linger long after their creators have gone, etched into the fabric of the lives they touched. James Monroe's story was one of resilience, of sacrifice, of love and betrayal. Yet, her final act, the one that had silenced the people who had once been closest to her, became the defining part of her legacy. The estate was quiet now. The house, once filled with the bustle of business calls, meetings, and lavish parties, was still, save for the occasional footstep echoing down the halls. It had been months since James had passed, and though the rooms seemed to stand as monuments to the life she had built, there was an undeniable sense of absence. Victoria Carter, James's loyal maid and confidant, stood in the hallway, her gaze soft as she looked out at the garden. The flowers James had planted in the backyard, vibrant bursts of color that had always been a symbol of hope and renewal, still bloomed. But now those flowers were a reminder of everything that had been left behind, of the sacrifices James had made for her family, of the trust she had extended to those who had betrayed her. Victoria had inherited it all. The estate, the fortune, the business, everything James had once held dear. And she was determined to ensure that James's story would not be forgotten. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the grand house, casting long shadows across the lawn, Victoria sat in the sitting room, reviewing James's will once again. The papers had been thoroughly examined by lawyers, and everything had been settled. But there was still something unspoken between the lines, something in the words that had always belonged to James. The legacy of resilience and justice was something Victoria could feel in every breath she took. She wasn't alone in the room. Emma Monroe, now in her late 20s, stood at the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face unreadable. Since the death of her mother, she had become a different person, hardened, distant. The bitterness that had grown between them had only deepened in the wake of James's passing. She had initially expected a portion of her mother's estate to be passed on to her, but that hope had vanished when she learned she had been written out of the will. "Do you ever wonder if she was right?" Emma's voice broke the silence, her back still to Victoria as she stared out at the garden. Victoria glanced up, but said nothing for a moment. The words Emma spoke were loaded with something deeper, regret, maybe, or a gnawing sense of loss that Emma was only now beginning to process. "What do you mean?" Victoria asked gently, her voice calm but firm. Emma shifted, turning slightly toward her eyes darker now, as if the weight of everything she had done and failed to do was finally crashing down on her. "I mean, do you ever think, if my mother hadn't done what she did, things could have been different? If she hadn't shut me out, if I hadn't betrayed her, if I hadn't let myself get caught up in all the lies, maybe we could have. I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't be standing here like this, wondering what comes next." Victoria's heart ached as she looked at Emma, who had always been more complex than she let on. Emma's outer defiance had always hidden a fragility, a yearning for something she never fully understood, not even herself. And now it was that same fragility that left her exposed. "Your mother loved you, Emma," Victoria said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "She always did. But love, it's not always about what we want. It's about what's right." Emma's face tightened. "I don't think I ever understood that. I don't think I ever really knew what was right." Victoria rose from her chair and walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "That's something you'll have to reckon with, just like the rest of us. But your mother's decisions weren't about punishing you. They were about protecting herself. She had to protect her heart, because she had already given so much of it to you." Emma's eyes flickered with something, guilt, regret, perhaps even a hint of clarity. But it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it had come. "I don't know how to live with that," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do I live with the fact that I betrayed her when she was the only one who ever believed in me?" Victoria reached out, and placed a hand on Emma's arm, offering her some semblance of comfort. "You learn, Emma. You learn to forgive yourself. It's the only way forward. Your mother, she forgave you long before you even realized it." Emma stared down at the floor for a long moment, her lips trembling. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet Victoria's, her expression had softened, just enough to show that something within her had cracked. She was no longer the hard, defensive woman who had walked into that room. She was, for a brief moment, the daughter she had been before the betrayals, before the silence. Weeks later, the first public memorial for James Monroe was held. Victoria stood at the podium, her expression solemn, but unwavering. The room was packed with people, former colleagues, acquaintances, business partners, but none of them knew James like she did. None of them had seen the woman behind the empire, the woman who had built it all from nothing, the woman who had loved fiercely, even when that love had been returned with cruelty. Victoria took a deep breath before speaking, her voice carrying through the room. James Monroe was not just a name on a business card or a headline in the papers, she began. She was a woman who gave everything to her family, to her legacy, and to the people she loved. She was strong, driven, and relentless, but she was also human, and it was that humanity that made her who she was. She loved fiercely, but she was also capable of great pain, and in her final moments, she made sure that her story would be told by the people who truly understood its worth. Victoria paused, her eyes scanning the room. She saw Emma sitting in the front row, her face a mixture of grief and regret. For the first time in a long time, Emma seemed to truly be listening, to truly be present in the way she had never been before. "I stand before you today as the one entrusted to carry on James's legacy," Victoria continued, her voice steady. "Not because of my loyalty or my service, but because I believe in the values she fought for. She believed in justice. She believed in truth. And above all, she believed in redemption. This is the foundation on which I will continue her work." After the speech, Emma approached Victoria. Her face was pale, and her eyes were still red from crying, but there was a softness to her now, a hint of something approaching understanding. I don't know what to say," Emma murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I failed her." Victoria smiled gently, her hand resting on Emma's shoulder. "You didn't fail her, Emma. You just lost your way for a while. But you're here now, and that's what matters. You can still choose to honor your mother's legacy." Emma's eyes filled with unused tears. "I will. I swear I will." Victoria nodded, feeling the weight of that promise settle between them. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was a start. As the months passed, Victoria moved forward with the estate, carefully managing the business and distributing the funds as James had instructed. She used the money to start a foundation in James's name, one dedicated to helping young women pursue careers in real estate and entrepreneurship. Exactly the kind of opportunities James had wanted for Emma, but had never been able to give her. In the end, James's legacy lived on, not just in the wealth she had accumulated, but in the lessons she had imparted, the sacrifices she had made, and the love she had given. And for Emma, it was a journey she would continue to walk, a path shaped by her mother's resilience and her own willingness to change. James Monroe's story would never be forgotten. Not by Victoria, not by Emma, and certainly not by anyone whose life had been touched by her strength. Her legacy would live on, a testament to the power of love, betrayal, and the quiet acts of justice that only time could reveal.